How long can Vladimir Putin afford to continue his war in Ukraine without inflicting economic pain on his own people? To talk about this, I'm delighted to be joined today by Alexandra Prokopenko from the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. Alexandra, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and honor.
I want to take you back to the weeks and months before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You were living in Moscow, working for the central bank as an advisor.
Correct.
Describe to me how you would have conveyed the economic situation back then.
Oh, you know, it's it's a good question, and it's interesting and always useful to keep in mind that before the war, Russia economy was in a quite good performance because of it was on its recovery pace after COVID, the most risks for Russian economy was spillover effects from advanced economies and probably some outbreaks of new pandemic or whatever. And then, so everything was stable and looked stable. And one more very interesting thing, because, when the war started, everyone outside of Russia repeatedly, and you may probably remember, US and UK authorities repeatedly told that it's going to be a war. And here in Russia, we saw that no, it's not going to be a war. It would be super crazy to have a war. So it's like, you know, it's like a big game or whatever. So it's a big bluff. It's not going to be a war. And I remember that a week before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I sat with my former colleague in one of the Moscow restaurants, and he tried, so he was he is an expert in Russia from international organization, and he tries to convince me that it's going to be the war. And I'm, as an insider, try to convince him that now it's not going to be, because it's crazy for the economy, it's crazy for people well-being, that it will undermine the whole growth and development and all efforts of government to bring economy back to recovery pace after COVID. So, and all outsiders were right, most insiders were wrong, and now we are where we are.
Talk to me a little bit about that early transformation into a war economy and what that meant for your colleagues that were working at the central bank. So you left your job at that point, we should say. Your conscience wouldn't allow you to stay in Russia. And you've been in Germany watching events from here pretty much since then. But what did those early weeks and months look like after the invasion?
So, shortly after the invasion, everyone was shocked. I mean, there wasn't some sort of meeting before the invasion where Putin will tell his advisors and his ministers and chief of central bank that he's going to invade. No, everyone was shocked. Everyone, all people I spoke with was absolutely terrified and feel themselves devastated. But then sanctions came, and speaking on behalf of economic bloc of Russian government and central bank, so they started to work as anti-crisis managers, the role they played a couple of times before. So it's very interesting. Also, I figured out that recently Russia faced 4 major crises during the last 15 years. It's extremely often compared to any kind of advanced and developing economies. So, and then 2 of these crises were absolutely handmade. It was first in 2014, first sanctions after annexation of Crimea, and then sanctions which came after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So, So these people started to act as anti-crisis managers, and I can remind you that first there was Russian reserves blocked, and Russian government and central bank retaliate. Then they banned they banned non-residents to withdraw liquid assets from Russia. Then they tried to develop some sort of defense measures for Russian economy, and they actually put the economy into an artificial coma. So they deal less with war outcomes, but they deal a lot with sanctions, with pure economic impact. So I think that they don't have much time for reasoning what they are doing, why they're not they had a clue what they're doing, but they didn't have much time reasoning why they're doing this.
Yeah, because when it comes to assessing how the Russian economy is doing, there seem to be two radically opposed camps, as you write as well. There seems to be one side that are saying the country is on the brink of collapse, and then the other that are saying, oh, we've never been stronger, look at the growth rates. And actually, these Western sanctions are buoying the economy. Where do you stand amid these radically opposed viewpoints?
Well, the reality is a little bit complicated. And in terms of sanctions, I need to say that there is some sort of disentanglement in perception of sanctions within Russian elites and Russian top bureaucrats. So they're dealing with only sanctions with its economical outcomes without, as I said, keeping in mind why the sanctions were actually imposed. So if you are isolated from the war, and it's actually possible if you're working in Moscow and dealing with only your part of and then doing your part of the job, which, for instance, related with financial markets, so you are dealing with transactions, for instance. What's going on in Ukraine? It's going in Ukraine. You can even not be familiar with the news if you are not checking them constantly. So you're dealing with some struggling because of transactions. And if you every day you are not reminding yourself why you're dealing with transactional problems, you very easy and very fast you will start to forget what was the reason behind all that. So actually. And I think this is a big problem with sanctions, the communicational one, which is underestimated by both in Russia and here in the West. And speaking about the debate here, of course, there are two different polar opinions. The reality is somewhere in the middle, since Russia's economy is a big animal, is a big and rigid animal. It's quite complicated to kill with one shot. So with a very short term, economy is performing well. It's partly because of it was on its recovery growth pace. Second, this growth, of course, is based on export revenues and on high spending. The fiscal impulse from Russian authorities in 2022 and 2023 exceeded 10% of GDP, historical high in Russia's history. So all this this fulfilling this economic growth 3.6% in 2023. But we need to always keep in mind that since Russian government will stop spending or decrease spending, growth figures would be different. And we already see the big problem between spending and inflation. Inflation is a problem for Russian authorities. It's a problem because it will mount problems in the midterm and in the long term. But now, well, it seems manageable. But well, it's always a trade-off for policymakers. Actually, the major reason of the inflation, the primary reason of the inflation is state spending. So there is a problem of right and the left hand in Russian economy. With one hand, Russian central bank trying to mitigate inflation, to tame price growing, and with another hand, government continues spending, and mostly on war. I mean, Putin committed war expenses in 2024, approximately 8% of GDP. It's another history record since in the history of modern Russia since the state was established after the collapsing of Soviet Union. And it's enormous. I mean, never before Russia spent so much. And here are extremely high wages of those people who are in trenches, state demand on weapons and ammunition, and inflation of enterprises, which is much higher than the average over economy. And if Russia continue to... So Putin will need to choose sooner or later between between his three priorities: financing the war, maintaining people's well-being, so paying pensions at the same amount, keeping wages and keeping people happy with the payments, and lower inflation. So achieving all three goals in one time, it's impossible.
That's something you refer to as Putin's trilemma, isn't it? Trying to balance those three things at once.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit more about oil because, of course, Putin did manage to find new buyers in China, in India and Turkey, for example. But that has also led to a kind of a shift in power dynamics. And I'm particularly interested in how that relates to Russia's relationship to China. You know, Russia is very much the junior partner there. How will that play out in the future, do you think, economically?
So economically, the dependency of Russia on China is growing. But China, I would say, benefits this kind of relationship a lot and enjoying it. It's quite cheap for China. I mean, Russia was a tiny market for Chinese producers, but after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it's transformed into medium market. We see that for Chinese policymakers, it's quite easy to massage Putin's ego, saying that he's a great man and a leader of a great country, but which brings to China cheap energy resources first and foremost. Then Chinese companies of, I would say, second and third row, since Chinese companies of the first row and Chinese banks are quite. I'm trying not to get along with Russia so much, so showing that they are respecting red lines drawn by the West. So, second row companies and third row and companies and banks, they're all enjoying this growing dependency. So, this will grow. I mean, so Russia will be more dependent on China, not only in terms of having a buyer on Russian energy resources, but also in terms of technological import, car making. So there are only two car makers on Russian market. Before it was the whole world compete there, and now there is only Russian Avtovaz and 14 Chinese brands. I mean, it's huge, and this transition happens only during 2 years. There is also a remarkable example from the region of heavy vehicles. The share of Chinese heavy vehicles and trucks on Russian market skyrocketed. It has increased on 600% during 1 year.
Which is mind-blowing.
It is. And when Russian producers like Ural and Kamaz, so they were focused on import substitution and fulfilling the demand from the army, from the state. Chinese industry just set the market. They occupied the market, and it would be quite complicated to push them out if and when Russia will think to do this.
Right. So it's fair to say that Russia has found new buyers for its energy.
Yes.
But there are other areas where Western sanctions have been hurting the economy a little bit more, especially in the area of technology. Maybe you have a couple of examples you can share about how that's affecting the economy.
So in terms of technology, there is Russia, not developing its offshore gas and oil because there is no access to technology. Russia lost, from what I heard, Russia lost its leadership. It wasn't a leadership, but it has a claim to be a leader in terms of AI, in terms of biomedical technologies, and Russia's industry struggling to get hardware and so both hardware and software. So they're switching from Western companies to Chinese vendors, and now they're feeling difficulties with payments, and also payments and transactions. All this settlements issue is also a bottleneck for Russia, and this bottleneck was created because of sanctions. There is a very interesting story because there is a room for interesting development between Russia and China in terms of creating parallel settlement infrastructure, which maybe in the super long term, not where we are decades from when it started to undermine dollar dominance, which Russian propaganda is trying to say. But Russia and China dealing a lot on this issue, and it's also an indicator that this is a problematic area created by sanctions. So in terms of coming back to technology, there are problems with computers, with semiconductors, which Russia cannot fulfill itself, which Russia cannot cannot substitute domestically or from China. So Russian businesses are now forced to deal with not systemic solutions, but with different kind of schemes, with different kind of third countries, kind of proxies, which can be which can be easily traced and banned by sanctions. So in general, it limits Russian productivity, and we see that wages are growing and inflation are growing, but Russian productivity is not growing at all.
Is there anger among the business community?
No, it's not an anger since I don't know. I would say correctly to say I know nothing about the anger. But business community, I know no one who is happy with the current situation. So the attitude of Russian business and Russian bureaucrats, I would describe with the very infantile formula that can we go back to February 2022 when there is a geopolitical struggle with the West, or how our leader understands that, but there is no war,
right,
which is distracting resources and which is really devastating. But because of the isolation, because of the design of personal sanctions, and because lots of people are in the lists with bad reasoning why they are here, because someone called them that they are near Putin or whatever. So the anti-Western sentiment is growing in Russia, and this is, well, on the long term, I think it's bad, since once this war ends and, both countries need to think, Russia will not disappear and EU will not disappear. So Union and Russia will need to think how they will live, how they will be neighbors in the future. And this anti-Western sentiment, of course, will poison this future for years.
And does that anti-Western sentiment also apply to the economic policymakers and advisors that you used to work with?
I find fascinating that some people who were responsible for attracting foreign investors into the Russian market now are actually quite skillful policymakers who are designing obstacles on the path of Western companies to withdraw their assets and to leave Russia. So some of these people feel themselves really offended, and they are acting in a retaliation mood. Some of them, they think that they are like fatalists, so they're dealing with the situation. But I think that here it is a big problem, since neither one side nor another knows how to deal with each other in the future. The very simple example is in terms of exchanges, institutional cooperation between Russian institutions in a very wide range in science, in universities, and corporate world, and the West. So all this stopped, and this looks like a double sarcophagus on a Russian human capital. So there is external pressure, the West who doesn't want to, or who are not dealing with Russians anymore because they're Russians, and from the inside, since every contact should be traced, or people from FSB are interested in every contacts, in every actions, and why you're reading for a Western article, why you're doing this. They're questioning people. It all creates the very, very bad environment. So people are, stopping to even be interested in what's going on here. And very easy, and Russian science and Russian universities, very easy will become, cut off the frontier, the science frontier, and the most recent developments in different science fields. And as I said, in the long run, it's dramatically decreases and damages the quality of human capital in Russia, and it's of course disturbing.
Do you think, though, on the other side, that you'll also see a deeper academic cooperation with the likes of China and India as a result of this?
So there are issues with the collaboration in China which are also disturbing, since there are multiple cases when FSB accusing Russian scientists in a state treason because of their collaboration with China. So I think Russian scientists are quite careful in this kind of collaboration too. But it's the science, the language of international science is English, and in Russia everything which is in English now sounds bad, and then the level of knowledge of Chinese is increasing. But it's only 2 years of Russian pivot towards east. So it's not enough to have a bunch of Chinese watchers, of experts who can fulfill the growing demand on China. Same with India. There wasn't Russia has a very few India watchers, even in a very peaceful times. They couldn't appear accidentally because Russian president decided to go on a war against Ukraine, and all country were forced to do what it's doing.
So on the one hand, you have this kind of a brain drain, but if you look at the labour market in general, things look quite good. Unemployment is down, wages in the defence sector are up. This will end as soon as the war ends. And I'm wondering if, in a kind of a twisted way, Putin actually has an economic incentive to prolong this as long as possible.
This is there is a very interesting backdrop on what you're calling a good side. So when unemployment is on this historically low level, so it's 2.8%, it basically means that there is no workers within the economy. So if there would be any kind of external demand opened or internal demand, so for instance, China will need Russian cars. And afterwards we'll say, okay, we can fulfill this demand. They simply cannot find people who will assemble the cars because there is no workers. So in Russian market, it's good, probably good situation in terms of worker, since employers are forced to pay them more, so people keep their jobs and not leaving their jobs and go to other employers. But on the backside, but there is also other side. So there are three major forces on Russian market who are competing for the labor force. It is an army itself who literally need men to put them on the trenches, and these men on the front line, they are getting enormous salaries. And the problem here is once the war ends, there is no reason for the state to keep the salaries. And this will, it is a big and open question to me how Russian authorities will manage this problem, which is actually, I think, semi-social. So there are people who think that they are war heroes, who want to be treated as war heroes, and their salaries are an unbearable burden for other taxpayers, both on corporates and on the individual side. So it would be a problem. The second force who is competing for Russian, the second force is military industry complex, which is extended. When I'm saying military industry complex, I mean not only industry which produces stuff for the army. I mean weapons, armory, tanks, guns, and so ever, and supplies, but also civil part of industry, which are now working 3 shifts. And they also they recruiting women on a typically men professions like drivers, truck drivers, heavy machinery operators, and so they also using teenagers labor in drones assembly lines because there is no workers in Russia, and they are also competing for a labor force. And third is the rest of economy, the civil part of economy. I mean, there is shortages. There is no sector in Russia which doesn't feel shortages of workers right now. So the situation isn't super bright, and there is no migrant inflow. Especially after Crocus terroristic attack, so migrants are not feeling this. Even before Crocus, they never feel themselves safe in Russia. Well, Russia is quite nationalistic country. I need to admit this. But now so migrants' inflow is almost stopped, and this is a limitation on development of the economy, which also means that prices will go up. because enterprises cannot raise the productivity, and also productivity is limited by sanctions, by technological sanctions. So the situation is okay in terms of current moment. In this particular moment, Russians feel themselves quite rich and wealthy. But its perception will change in 3 years, or in the midterm, I would say 3 years. It's in the midterm when situation will change, and situation will change. So when I'm writing about some time frame, I usually back on a time frame provided by military experts who are saying that in terms of, so from the pure military standpoint, for the war, for the stance of war, it's the next 12, 18 months would be decisive. And because the economy and the stance of Russian economy is the function of what's going on at the front line, if Putin will decide to accelerate and to escalate, and if Russia wants to have another offensive, it would be some extra expenditures from the budget and some extra pressure and tightness on the system. So the equation would be different. So if we are talking about from 12 to 18 months time frame with the current conditions, so the situation would be relatively the same as it's today, Putin has enough money to continue to fulfill all three his goals. After that, he will face budget burden, budget problems because of inflation.
You know, you mentioned earlier that Putin is spending 8% of GDP on defense. I think about a third of this year's budget is going in that direction. That is, of course, at the expense of other areas like social spending, healthcare, education. Are Russian people feeling the effects of that sort of prioritization already?
So social spending is not cut, and it's actually accelerated. So there was a very interesting trend we're witnessing right now. So a very interesting, the changes in the people's attitude of wealth distribution since 90s, and the first time ever we see this. So because of the war, because people from low income stratas are pure beneficiaries of this war, they feel themselves more rich and happy, and they think that the situation with distribution of wealth within the economy is more fair than it was before. So we're in a very paradoxical situation that people are not feeling, people lived quite badly before. Now their living conditions improved. They are not thinking, they don't have any time or any kind of long time horizon. They are not planning for a long time. So they're living they're living with today, and for today they're fine. So people are noticing that their life is changing, but for some people life changed in a good way, so they are pretty happy with that.
You've mentioned before that the longer this war continues, the worse the hangover will be. And I'm not going to ask you to try to predict when the war will end, but I am interested in your take on how Vladimir Putin will deal with a bad hangover.
I think that people's living standards will decrease, but they will decrease moderately. So we will see. So people will have less money because of inflation. So probably the figures they will see from their SMS from banks would be relatively the same, but the the consumer capacity of these sums will be different. Then I think we will witness a growing level of accidents. With machinery, with floods, with fires, with the utilities, with all this stuff because of the sanctions. So it's complicated to find particles for the industry, and because of underfinancing the whole industry, people will see that. So there would be less roads built and less industry, less infrastructure would be built because the cost of this construction is raising because of the inflation. So I think he will choose gradual worsening of living standards, and he will of course say that it's all because of the West, it's all because of the cruel West, all because of the sanctions. And this is very important, what we need to realize about Russia. Russia is on its survival mode. So when we're looking on this with our matrix of normal business cycle, well, it's okay. And then here we can say that there is no bright future in the midterm. But if they are super happy and they're encouraging themselves when they can bypass sanctions, when they can find something new, very temporary, and they're encouraging with all this tiny success. And all this means survival mode, yeah.
So control of the messaging might be the most powerful force there. Alexandra Prokopenko, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.